63 years ago, a young gas station attendant in Wisconsin was brutally murdered at his own workplace. His wife was just 50 feet away inside their home, completely unaware that within 15 minutes she would walk over and discover her husband's body bearing 53 stab wounds, covered by a blanket that nobody could account for. Authorities had a suspect in their sights early on and received tips pointing to him in both 1968 and 2009, but the evidence was never strong enough to support charges, and the investigation eventually lost momentum. Through all of it, however, investigators never formally closed the file. They continued submitting evidence to new laboratories over the years, holding onto that blanket from the 1963 crime scene as the last remaining thread that might one day answer a question more than 6 decades old. Then in 2024, a private forensic technology company applied an analytical method beyond the capabilities of the national system, and the blanket the killer had draped over his victim gave up a name that left everyone connected to the case stunned. The summer of 1963 settled over Winnebago County, Wisconsin with the unhurried warmth of a Midwestern season. Life along Highway 41, roughly 60 miles southwest of Green Bay, moved at a familiar and comfortable pace. People knew their neighbors. An ordinary evening felt like exactly that, ordinary. Wayne Pratt was 24 years old, running the Enco gas station on Highway 41 and building the early foundations of an adult life. He had steady work, a wife named Marie, and a small house situated just 50 feet from the station itself, close enough that the two could see one another through the windows, close enough that distance was never a source of worry. On the evening of June 12, 1963, Wayne was at home watching television when a car pulled into the station at around 8:40 in the evening. There was nothing unusual about it. Customers came and went at that hour all the time. Wayne got up and walked the 50 feet to the station without a second thought. Marie stayed home, assuming he would be back shortly. Roughly 15 minutes later, she glanced out the window and noticed something was off. The station lights had not been switched on, even though Wayne always turned them on at that time of evening to stay visible to passing customers. She walked over to check. The station was dark and unusually quiet. She went inside and called out his name. No response came from the front of the building. She made her way toward the small back room behind the cashier counter, a space Wayne sometimes used to rest during slower parts of his shift, and pushed open the door. Wayne Pratt was on the floor, motionless, covered with a blanket, as though someone had tried to conceal what they had done, or had wanted that covered form to be the final image left behind. From the window of their home to the place where her husband died, 50 feet. Not a remote location, not a dangerous setting, not somewhere anyone would have thought twice about him being. Just the gas station next to the house, the place that should have been the safest spot in the world because Marie could see it from where she stood. She called the police, and Winnebago County found itself facing a murder that would take 61 years to close. What officers discovered when they arrived left no room for uncertainty about the savagery of the attack. The autopsy confirmed that Wayne had been stabbed 53 times. His leg was caught in a pile of overturned tires in the back room, suggesting he had tried to run or fight back before being overwhelmed. 53 wounds is not the mark of a momentary loss of control. It speaks to someone who did not stop until there was simply nothing left to continue. But the most puzzling detail at the scene was not the number of wounds. It was the blanket. After inflicting 53 stab wounds, the killer had paused long enough to cover Wayne's body before leaving the building. Over the course of 61 years of investigation, no one was ever able to adequately explain why. It did not appear to serve any practical concealment purpose, and it did not fit neatly into any familiar pattern investigators could point to. It remained one of the case's enduring mysteries. Investigators also noted something else of significance. The attacker had not left the scene unharmed. Biological evidence at the scene indicated that Wayne had managed to wound his assailant during the struggle, meaning the killer left that gas station carrying injuries of his own. Investigators concluded the most likely motive was a robbery gone wrong. Gas stations were well-known targets for cash theft, and someone had pulled into the Enco station that night with no intention of buying fuel. Dozens of interviews were conducted throughout the 1960s and every available investigative tool of the era was put to use. In the early days following the murder, one name surfaced: William Doc Stater of Bowler, Wisconsin. He was identified as a suspect relatively quickly, but identification and sufficient evidence for an arrest are two very different things, and in 1963 there was no technology capable of bridging that gap. No arrest followed. By 1968, the last remaining leads had run dry and the case went cold. The blanket, however, the one the killer had laid over Wayne Pratt's body on the floor of that back room, was placed into storage in Winnebago County. No one at the time could have known that the decision to preserve it would ultimately prove to be the single most consequential choice made in the entire investigation. Tips connecting Doc's data to the crime came in again in 1968, 5 years after the murder. Investigators received them, followed up on them, and ran into the same wall they always had. The evidence simply was not there to move forward. In 2009, 4 to 6 years after the crime, tips pointing to Doc's data surfaced once again. The result was the same. The same wall. The same unanswered question gathering dust in the Winnebago County archives. Throughout those years, journalist Andy Thompson of the Appleton Post-Crescent had followed the case for decades, writing about Wayne Pratt and keeping the story of the 24-year-old man stabbed 53 times in the gas station next to his own home alive in the public consciousness when virtually nothing else was doing so. The Winnebago County Sheriff's Office would later take the unusual step of formally acknowledging Thompson's contribution in their 2024 case resolution statement, a public thank you from a law enforcement agency to a journalist, something that almost never happens in cold case announcements. Thompson did not live to see the answer arrive. But the work he sustained over decades was part of the reason this case never fully disappeared into silence the way so many cold cases do. Marie Pratt, the woman who had walked those 50 feet on the night of June 12, 1963, and found her husband covered by a blanket with 53 stab wounds, continued living her life while the file sat in storage. The name Doc's data drifted in and out of the investigation across 6 decades, and the question of who killed Wayne Pratt remained without a definitive answer. Then, in 2011, the first real door opened. The Winnebago County Sheriff's Office formally reopened the case to evaluate whether modern DNA technology could do what 1963 technology could not. Evidence was submitted to various laboratories for analysis, and among those items was the blanket, the one the killer had placed over Wayne Pratt's body, preserved in county storage for nearly 50 years. In 2015, Sorensen Forensics of Utah, a leading forensic DNA laboratory, examined the blanket and found exactly what investigators had been hoping for: DNA. But the discovery came with a complication nobody had anticipated. The DNA recovered was not a clean single-source profile. It was a mixture, genetic material from multiple individuals blended together in a way that standard analytical methods could not untangle. And at that time, CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, did not accept mixed DNA profiles for suspect matching because they did not meet the technical requirements for reliable comparison. Investigators knew the killer's DNA was on that blanket. The blanket the killer himself had placed over Wayne Pratt's body more than 50 years earlier. But there was no technical pathway within the existing system to connect that DNA to a name. The case stalled for a second time, not from lack of effort, not from absence of evidence, but because the rules and limitations of the system created a barrier that the technology of 2015 could not break through. For 9 years, from 2015 to 2024, investigators sat with the knowledge that the killer's DNA existed on that blanket, preserved and waiting, with no permissible way to use it. But the world of DNA science was not standing still during those 9 years. Private companies operating outside the constraints of the state system were developing sophisticated methods for analyzing complex mixed DNA profiles, methods not bound by CODIS requirements, not limited by what the national system could process, and capable of doing precisely what had been impossible in 2015. In 2017, new information about Doc's data, the name that had appeared in the files since 1963, gone quiet after 1968, resurfaced in 2009, and now returned again, gave investigators enough to take a step that had not previously been available to them. In 2018, a search warrant was obtained to collect a DNA sample from William A. Doc's data, by then 82 years old and living in Bola, Shawano County. To anyone looking at him, he was simply an elderly man. Nothing about him pointed visibly to a summer night in 1963 at an Enco gas station on Highway 41. Doc's data was not the only individual asked to provide a sample during this phase of the investigation. Investigators were pursuing multiple avenues simultaneously, but he was the one toward whom every tip, every piece of information accumulated over more than 5 decades, continued to point. In April 2022, William Doc's data died. The man who had been a suspect from the earliest days of the investigation, whose name had appeared in tips in 1968, again in 2009, again in 2017, who had provided a DNA sample at the age of 82, died before the technology existed to definitively confirm what investigators had long believed. He died without ever standing in a courtroom. He died without ever being required to answer for the 53 stab wounds, the blanket, and the night of June 12, 1963. 2 years later, the answer came anyway. In 2023, Sorensen Forensics conducted another updated analysis of the blanket. The mixture problem remained. The technical barrier held. But in 2024, a Pittsburgh-based private company called Cybergenetics entered the case with a system called TrueAllele. This was not a state laboratory. It was not the CODIS system. It was a privately developed analytical tool built specifically to solve the kind of problem that CODIS could not: degraded DNA recovered after many decades, and complex mixed profiles containing genetic material from multiple sources woven together. TrueAllele does not attempt to simplify the mixture. Instead, it performs a deep statistical analysis of the entire profile, calculating the probability that each genetic component belongs to a specific individual in a manner that standard systems are not designed to do. The result: William Dockstader's DNA was on the blanket. The blanket the killer had personally placed over Wayne Pratt's body in the back room of that gas station 61 years earlier had held his genetic material all along, through every decade of uncertainty, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right way. Investigators forwarded the complete file to the Winnebago County District Attorney's Office. In July 2024, the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office stood before the public and announced that the Wayne Pratt case, the longest-running cold case in Wisconsin history, had an answer. That answer carried the name William A. Dockstader of Bola, Wisconsin. The man suspected from the very beginning. The man Tips had named in 1968, in 2009, in 2017, never with quite enough to act on. District Attorney Eric Spa reviewed the file and confirmed what Wayne and Marie Pratt's family had waited more than 6 decades to hear. There was sufficient evidence to establish probable cause and support a murder charge, if William Dockstader was still alive. He was not. He had died in April 2022, 2 years before TrueAllele found his DNA on the blanket, 2 years before the final answer arrived. There was no trial. No conviction. No moment in a courtroom where Wayne Pratt's family could look his killer in the eye. But there was an answer. And after 61 years, that was what the system was able to give. The Wayne Pratt case leaves behind 3 lessons worth carrying forward. The first is about physical evidence. If you or your family have ever been connected to an unsolved criminal case, as a victim, a witness, or a surviving relative, preserve everything you possibly can and never assume that old evidence has lost its value. The blanket from 1963 was meaningless with the technology of 1963, meaningless in 1985, meaningless in 2000. But in 2024 it was decisive. No one can predict the year in which technology will become capable of answering questions that currently have no answers. The only thing that guarantees technology will have its chance is that the evidence is still there when that moment arrives. The second lesson concerns the limits of the system itself. CODIS is a powerful investigative tool, but it is not the only one, and when the state system reaches its technical boundaries, specialized private companies like Cybergenetics and Sorensen Forensics sometimes represent the only remaining path. If you are pursuing justice for an unsolved case, do not stop when the system tells you there is no way forward. That usually means there is no way forward within the current system, not that no way exists at all. The third lesson is about tips. If you know something about an unsolved case, whether that information is 10 years old, 30 years old, or 60 years old, contact your local law enforcement agency and share it. The tip that arrived in 2009 about a crime committed in 1963 was one of the pieces that eventually contributed to the 2024 resolution. You cannot know which piece will be the final one until the full picture is complete. If this story was meaningful to you, please subscribe so you do not miss the cases still to come. We will see you in the next one.